Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's MWF webinar. My name is Tanya, and I'm the Marketing Manager over here at Struxsoft. Just a few things before we start. For those of you who are new with us today, our principal software, MWF, which stands for Metal Wood Framer, is our automated Revit wall, floor, ceiling, and truss framing software for light gauge steel and also wood modeling. Today, our senior technician, Christina, will be walking us through our MWF Coordination Tools, including how to detect clashes, how to create openings around MEP and structural intersections, and how to clash MEP elements against studs, tracks, and other framing elements. Today, we're going to have a little short but sweet webinar, which will last around 30 minutes. Just a few housekeeping items before we start. At the end of the webinar, we'll be taking a few live questions. To be selected, please press the raise hand button on the control panel. Just please also make sure that your computer audio is working correctly. If you'd prefer, you can also ask questions throughout the webinar in the questions tab of the GoToWebinar dashboard. All right, that's it for me. I'm going to hand off to Christina now.
All right, thanks, Tanya. Hey, everyone, good afternoon. So for today's webinar, I thought we mainly focus on this interference tool and the drop down in here and some of the commands. So we're going to start off with the basic clash detection. So if anyone who coordinates uses this, then I'm sure you guys have used this tool before. And then I thought I'd cover a bit of the options to review openings, maybe merge things together. And then we're going to wrap it all up with this MEP Clash, and we'll go from there. So before I go ahead and run the clash detection, I'm just going to go ahead and grab my walls. I've got a LinkedIn file over here. So again, a LinkedIn file doesn't necessarily have to be made with Revit. It could be another third-party software. As long as the link has coordinates, it's a shared internal link, and has some kind of 3D volume, not just like with 2D files. You can basically link that into your model and you're good to go. So this can be done with empty walls like I mentioned, or I do have one framed wall over here that I can go ahead and apply it to as well. But let's just grab a few of these guys, and we're going to run clash detection. So once this pops up, I've got my list of intersecting categories. So it doesn't just kind of strictly have to be MEP or structural elements. I actually think these guys are coming in as generic models, so that works completely fine. And I'm also going to set up a rule for my clash. And if any one of you guys didn't catch the first webinar that I did where I covered some of these automated options, highly recommend to go double check. This is basically just going to be a nice little rule set, which I'll show you guys in a little bit. That's going to basically dictate how your openings frame out automatically, the tolerances, the types of headers they get. So that's what the rule set is going to be used for. So I'm going to go ahead and let this run. And it's basically just going to punch out all of my MEP with some Revit openings. So I can see here I've already got tolerances built into them. If we go ahead and actually go check out the opening, I can see that it's already been stamped with a marker. And this is all according to that rule set. So I covered this a little bit more in depth in the first webinar, but you can basically create a rule set for your clash detection. And in this case, I've got it based off width, and I just have it filtered down to only apply to ducts and generic models. And the tolerances are also built in here. But basically, this is how you can set up the rules for your clashes. Also, just based on that, it'll auto select or auto apply, I should say, the marker. So that's the clash detection that's been used on this guy. And I'm also just going to point out one little thing. Let me go rerun Clash on this particular wall. So on this particular wall, two things I just want to highlight. I've got an actual element which isn't linked in, which I'll talk about in a second. But if you do have maybe smaller elements that are penetrating your wall, I've got a little pipe running through here. And unfortunately, because it is partially into the wall, it will pick that up as a clash. But what you can do to kind of work your way around that situation is in your rule set. Let's go back. There we go. Over here, I've got a rule for my particularly small width range. So if it's anything less than like 6 inches, I've got my marker automatically set to ignore. So it's going to ignore openings like that altogether and basically pretend it doesn't exist. So if you're all worried about little small penetrants and the clash detection picking them up and framing them out, you can always create your rules to get around that. But with anything else that was ran through my clash, it'll pick that up. And I've also got that little pipe again, which is completely ignored. Let's just set up our wall transparency so you guys can see this a bit better. There we go. So the next thing I do want to highlight as well are some of the options in this wall coordination or interference dropdown. So one of those things is merging openings together. So by default, we do create 2 separate openings per object. Obviously, when time does come to frame around this, it might get a little tricky. You might have your headers too close together. It'll cause a bit of a clash. So obviously, you'd probably just want that in one large opening. So if you are kind of manually reviewing your openings and you do notice this, there's a pretty simple tool that you can use just to say merge by selection. So I've got my 2 openings selected. I can run that. And then, as you can pretty much predict, it merges them into one large opening. So that's one way that you can go about it if you just notice some elements that might be a little too close together. The other way I'm going to highlight is if you want to automate it a little bit more. There is this merge openings option directly in the Clash. So when you do run it from the get-go, you can have them automatically merge into one larger opening. So with this, it's just going to be set up with tolerances. So if, let's say, my openings are within 6 inches of each other, then I can merge this into one automatically. And you can apply your same rule set to these openings. So just apply the same way of how they're going to frame out. So those are the 2 main things I do want to highlight in terms of merging. And pretty much once your openings are set, you can go ahead, grab your walls, frame those out like you would any other panel. And the openings, which are just Revit wall openings, will of course be picked up. So the other options are if you want to review some of your openings and obviously see what exact openings have been created. There's a command here, pretty simple enough, called review openings. And automatically when we run our clash detection, we do assign a status to these openings. So just to run it kind of basically, I'm gonna leave everything selected. Let's check this off. And you can see here, this is every single opening that's been created with the tool. You get the Revit ID. There's a status associated to them. So those same statuses that I was talking about, if they're conflicting or if they need review, we automatically stamp them as new, of course, but you could always change that. And with the case for my little rectangular pipe clash here, there's even an option to delete the opening altogether. So you could stamp it, have it ignore it with that rule set option, or you can just delete it outright in here. So it'll give you that little D in the action. Let's just say that it's been deleted. So let's say I can set a few openings that they need review. Let's check that off. So when I go ahead and rerun this tool to review openings, I can of course isolate it to just one particular status. And then it'll bring that in. And the other thing I'm just going to highlight in here is that you do have the option to select the host. So if you do want to highlight the entire Revit wall, maybe isolate that in 3D, you can select the host, highlight the entire line, and then when you come out of here, your wall is going to stay selected. So all these tools are relatively simple, but it at least is nice that you've got those options to go through everything opening by opening if you want to. So next option that you do have in terms of those opening statuses, if you did want to maybe manually work through the project or run through your openings, and then you do notice that one of the openings needs review or is conflicting with something, there is an option in here to go ahead and say, set opening status. I can grab a particular opening. And you can assign it this way as well. So you do have the option to do it more of a tabular way and work through the table. Or we could always go ahead and manually apply it. And with any of these statuses, there is a tool to just manually grab the openings by their status. And again, this will just select them with Revit. So if you want to go ahead and isolate these, you can always bring that into another view. So I'd say those are probably the more important tools in this interference option. Last thing I'd of course just like to touch on is the clash detection report. So this is, again, another little table that will give you a summary of everything that's going on in terms of Clash. But what I do like about this guy is that it shows you the types of penetrating objects that you have. So it'll show you the category, it'll give you the shape, it also gives you the size of the opening that was created along with it, and it will give you a count and basically group all the identical ones together. So besides that, if there is anything that's live, so I can see here that these are from an older linked file that I had, but if there is anything that's actually modeled live, like my other duct here, we'll tell you the actual classification system, so it's a duct, if it's been insulated, if it is insulated, the thickness of that. So it'll really give you a good summary of the objects that you have clashing with your wall. So this is the main thing I just wanted to highlight with the report. The other ones will give you a good summary of the openings that were created, but this will at least give you a good summary of the objects that are clashing with your walls. Okay. So next, I'm going to switch and we can take a look at the MEP Clash. So anything basically in these top three sections are for perpendicular penetrations into your wall, so to create those Revit openings. But the MEP options down here are actually for anything that's running through your studs. So if you do have pipes, basically anything that's running through, you can create openings automatically with the whole series. So for anyone who isn't familiar with the whole series option, let's first grab our panel. Go ahead and edit the whole series. So the whole series are basically just geometry of different hole types that you can make to punch out your studs. So this is created with the base software. And if anyone is roll forming, sending this to a CNC, can of course put in the operation code and your studs will be punched out with that hole. So I can already see here, I've got basically just a slot hole type, 1.5 inches, and I'm associating this guy particularly to my plumbing. But you can always edit the shape, change out the diameter. So you can really customize the hole type that you need to see. So let's go ahead and save that. And now we can go ahead and actually set up the MEP Clash. So we're going to work kind of going bottom up. We'll start with the mapping. So with this guy here, I'm obviously going to set it up for pipes, but it does work on generic models, any electrical fixtures. So basically these categories. And for this particular type, it'll load in your opening hole series types. So let's pick that slot hole. So all I'm doing now is associating my particular pipe type. So I labeled this guy as my water supply. and that's taken on my 1.5 inch hole. So once you've associated the family type to an actual hole, we can then go ahead and add an operation. So you can go ahead and add different operations based on the type of object that's running through your studs, based on the hole type. But you'll see what this operation does. It's basically just going to enable the clash with specific types of members. So once I add that in, I could again pick other categories if I needed to. If they have a hole type associated, it'll work in the same operation. But I've just got pipe selected. I'm again only doing this operation for the water supply, no other type of pipe. And then the other thing to set up is just the clashing family that runs with these pipes. So these are all the different member types that you can have in the panel. So if you didn't want it punching out your cripples, let's say, if you wanted to ignore your opening members, then all you'd have to do is unselect it from this list. Regardless of how the hole type was set up, it wouldn't punch out. So simple enough. I'm going to leave more or less every single member type selected. And again, that is our operation. So last thing to do is just to actually run the command. And this is where the operation is going to make a bit more sense. I can pick which clash I want to run. So I'm going to run it for my pipes. I've got my panel selected. And we can see here, because I have an opening right above it, this guy's obviously a cripple, so it wasn't punched out. Ideally, you'd probably want to punch this guy out, but just to show, if you don't enable it on the list, it doesn't have to be punched out with that member type. But every other basic infill type of member was punched out. My bottom track was punched out as well. So if you do have an elbow running through your bottom track, it will pick that up. It doesn't just have to be with your vertical studs. Basically, any type of member you associate it, it'll just simply create the opening. So last command on here is just to remove the hole types. So it'll tell me the panel's processed, my 4 holes were deleted. If you ever did want to clean out the panel and maybe reassociate another operation, can always remove those holes. And as per usual with most commands, if you do set up a pretty long list of operations, you can always export these settings, import them into another project, and they could of course be always modified. If I did want to, let's say, enable my cripples, I can go ahead and redo that. So that is going to wrap it up for me today. If any of you have any questions, feel free to post them.
Awesome. Thank you, Christina. As she mentioned, it looks like we have time to answer a few questions. If you'd like to pose a question live, please raise your hand now by clicking on the hand icon in the control panel. Just please also make sure that your computer audio is working correctly. While we wait for any questions to come through, I'd just like to remind everyone that the recording of the webinar will be sent through shortly after the session is closed. As always, please feel free to share the recording with any colleagues. All right, Christina, looks like we have a question that came through our dashboard. What are the other types of models aside from Revit that we can use to Clash? NWD, IFC, 3D AutoCAD?
Yeah, so CAD files will work fine again, as long as they're 3D. So the main thing is just that they can't be 2D lines, they can't be 2D faces, obviously. We need to have some kind of volumetric object. And the other main important thing as well is that there are internal coordinates that Revit can pick up, so we can orient it in the project. So yeah, 3D AutoCAD, you shouldn't have any issues as long as it meets all these criteria.
Perfect, thank you. I'm just going to wait a few more seconds to see if any other questions have come through. All right, it looks like we have a question from Thomas. Thomas, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Go ahead, Thomas. Hi, Thomas.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I was just curious. This might not be exactly related to this, but I was curious if you have any tutorial or video on chase walls.
Yeah, so anything in the software you can probably find in this MWF tutorials. It's going to give you a good link to the online help center, and I'm pretty sure there's some stuff on chase walls in there.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. All right, well, I think that just about wraps it up for today. For any questions that haven't been answered, we'll make sure to get to them by the end of the day today. Once again, I want to say thank you to Christina and thank you to everyone who has registered for the webinar. I just want to mention as well, just stay tuned. We'll be having a webinar every Wednesday for the next few weeks. Next week's we'll cover multi-layer within MWF. All right, we'll now be ending the webinar. Thank you.